Welcome back to American Motherhood, the Schoolhouse Series, where we break down the issues shaping our schools, our kids, and our communities, without the jargon and without the politics getting in the way of understanding. Today's episode is one I've personally been wanting to do for a long time, because if you've ever heard phrases like fair school funding or EdChoice and thought, okay, but what does that actually mean? You're not alone. We're going to unpack what fair really means when it comes to school funding, why different students cost different amounts to educate, and how decisions made at the state level directly impact what happens in your local schools. And we're also going to talk about EdChoice, what it is, how it works in Ohio, and why it's become such a central part of the school funding conversation. Joining us today is someone who has spent years deeply involved in education policy and school funding in Ohio, Stephen Dyer. Stephen is a longtime education policy expert and former Ohio legislator who has worked extensively on school funding issues, including analyzing how funding formulas impact districts, students, and taxpayers across the state. Stephen, thank you so much for being here today.
Good to be here.
So I want to start really foundational because I think a lot of people hear fair school funding and assume it just means more money or equal money, but it's actually a lot more nuanced than that. What are the core principles behind fair school funding and the plan specifically for Ohio?
It's deceptively simple, but it's something we as a state have struggled to do for years now, decades even. And the idea behind the Fair School Funding Plan is let's figure out how much it costs to educate kids in each district and then fund that district so that they can educate their kids. I mean, it's at its fundamental level, that's what it really is. So they try to say, well, here's how many teachers you need given your size. Here's what teachers typically cost. You need X number of buildings. You need X number of principals. I mean, it's really very simple soup to nuts kind of stuff, trying to figure out what it costs to educate kids. And then the real innovation of the Fair School Funding Plan, which when I was in the legislature 15 years ago, we did something called the evidence-based model, which was very similar, different name, but very similar. The real innovation is committing the state to actually fully funding its end of the bargain. So the way that school funding generally has worked in Ohio and has worked in nearly every other state in the country is the state picks up a certain cut and then local property taxpayers typically pick up the other side of the cut. The art of it is determining how much of each district and the state should pick up. And that varies. It varies depending upon your ability to raise local revenue. It varies on how much income the district has. For example, there are some districts in the state of Ohio that have very high property values, but very low income. That doesn't quite compute, but there's a district near me where they have a very high property value because there are a series of lakes in the middle of the district, and there are very wealthy people living on lake homes, but 80% of the folks living there live in very modest homes. So their actual income is low, but their property value is high. So how do you deal with that kind of district? So figuring that out has always been a challenge. But for many years, except for the couple of years we had the evidence-based model under Governor Strickland, and since we've had the Fair School Funding Plan, generally what the state has done is say, look, this is how much money we have, this is how much we gave you last year, so we'll give you a few more bucks and, move on. And that's not very helpful because they never really try to figure out how much it costs to educate kids in Ohio. The amount you got last year was probably less than what you needed. So they're just giving you a few bucks on top of an already inadequate amount. So what does that force school districts to do? I don't need to tell you this, but you need to go to the ballot all the time. And so a lot of the frustration that people are feeling about property taxes are driven because the state will not fund education properly, even though it's the only thing the Ohio Constitution requires the General Assembly to do is to fund a thorough and efficient system of common schools. They just haven't done it. They're afraid of the amount, they're afraid of the money, but they're not afraid of giving huge tax breaks to huge companies and rich people and, all that kind of stuff. I mean, we've seen the income tax drop to almost nothing at this point. They want to get rid of the income tax, even though that was the most progressive tax that we had. So the more you made, the more you paid. The less you made, the less you paid. So, I mean, for some reason, they have just absolutely refused to do the one thing that the legislature is required to do in the Constitution, and that's provide a thorough and efficient system. The Fair School Funding Plan, if fully funded, would get us probably pretty close to that. The problem is they haven't funded it properly. They said they would fund it over 3 budget cycles. In the 3rd budget cycle, they just said, well, we fully funded it, but we're basing it all on costs from 3 years ago, which is, billions short, I should say. So again, we're back in the same struggle. And what's worse now is the state knows it's not providing what kids need in every school district. And instead of saying, well, we just can't afford it, what they're saying is, no, we're giving you plenty. You deal with it. And so they're actually rigging the formula now to make it look like they're doing them enough, but they're simply not. So anyway, so what's fair about the Fair School Funding Plan, in theory, is that it figures out how much you need to educate a kid in your district based on, buses and, buildings, teachers, superintendents, treasurers, support staff, all that stuff. And then it comes through a very complex formulation. It determines, well, because you have this amount of property wealth and this amount of income wealth, we think you can come up with this amount locally. So we'll pick up the rest. That's in a nutshell what it is. It's great if they fully fund it. If they don't fully fund it, then we are kind of back where we've always been. At least we have a formula now, though, so we have some way of driving the discussion.
That's very helpful. Let's break down the difference between equity and equality in school funding.
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't giving every school or every student the same amount of money considered fair?
Because not every kid needs the same amount. But the way I describe this is, let's say we're all going to see the new Avengers movie. And let's say, I'm just using round numbers, so it costs $10 each, right? And there are 4 of us who want to go. $40 should get us into the movie. That's equality. So that's equal funding. Here's the problem. Let's say you only have 30, but you know that your buddy Phil has always got a few bucks lying around. So you're not going to give him 10, you're going to give him 7. And then you know that John never has any money, so you give him 10. You've got $5 that you found in your desk drawer or something, so you're going to give yourself 5, and then the rest you give to the other person. That is equity in a nutshell. Basically giving what each district needs based on what their student needs are and what their community needs are is equity. So it's not the same amount. And again, I ran into this all the time when I was in the legislature, because the Republicans in the Senate always wanted to talk about equity as in give charter schools the same amount of money we're giving local school districts. That is not the definition of equity. The definition of equity is giving what every student needs and every district needs, rather than just the same amount to everybody. And that's essentially what the state has been doing over the last, I'd say 30 plus years, except for a few years of the ABM and a few years of the Fair School Funding Plan, is they basically say, all right, you all get $6,200 a kid. When you use averages, nobody is average. So everybody gets a little more, or everybody gets a little less than what they need. What the Fair School Funding Plan does is it says, no, you don't need 6,300. You need 82. This district, because they have a lot of special needs kids, or they have a lot of kids who are economically disadvantaged, they're going to need, 9,800. This district is very wealthy and, very capable of serving its students' needs. So maybe you only need 2,000. So again, it's a calculation of what actually students need and what communities need. And it's actually a lot more fiscally responsible and efficient because you're trying to figure out how much every kid needs rather than just, here's how much we have, go for it. You're probably overpaying in a lot of districts. You're probably underpaying in a lot of districts. But one thing you're not doing is providing what every student needs in every district. And that's what the Fair School Funding Plan does. So that's the difference between equality and equity. They kind of get used interchangeably, but equity is providing what you need, what a student needs in order to get into the movie. And equality is, I'm just going to give everybody $9 to get into the movie, but they're not going to get into the movie because they're all $1 short. That's the difference.
Yeah, I always think back to this image I saw online explaining equity versus equality. And it was a bunch of kids, all different heights, lined up under an apple tree trying to pick apples. Mm-hmm. And everyone was given the same height ladder. And that was equality, where maybe one of the kids didn't even need it because he was tall enough to reach the apple. And maybe one of the kids, he needed it, but it wasn't even tall enough for him to still reach the apple. Versus equity is everyone got different height ladders to help them reach that apple. Help us understand then, what are some of the biggest factors you think might increase the cost of educating a child, maybe beyond just like the baseline average cost?
Well, there are several things, and this is one of the things that the formula takes into account. The poverty status of children is very indicative of educational need and challenge. Mm-hmm. So again, for every kid that's economically disadvantaged, you're going to have to give them additional resources in order to overcome that disadvantage. Same thing with special needs students. And the state categorizes them into 7 different categories depending on need. So each of those categories gets a different amount. There are other things. I mean, one of the things that the formula does that's really cool, I think, is they start building into the formula costs for school psychologists, which is actually pretty innovative. Recognizing the needs of students in that arena is also important. So those are the big ticket items. There are also, things like additional gifted services. Right now, we just pay to test whether the kids are gifted. We don't give any money to districts to actually provide the services. So, those are additional challenges or different kind of challenge, but they are a challenge. So again, all of these things kind of interact and interplay. And the more you have of one over the other, the more the state says that you're going to need to meet the needs of your students. And then, of course, once they come up with that figure, then they decide what the community can provide versus what the state should be providing. So those are the big ticket items. In terms of need. Another need that a lot of people don't talk about, and it's especially is busing. Busing is a huge challenge, and the state has underfunded it for many years. It's always been a challenge, not just paying for gas, paying for upkeep on old buses, but keeping the fleet relatively new. Those kinds of things are really expensive endeavors, and depending on the kind of district you are in, you could be more or less affected by that as well. So those are all kind of the big ticket item challenges that every district faces.
That's really helpful. So wrapping it up with the fair school funding topic, walk us through Representative Bob Cupp and John Patterson, what they set out to do. Do you think it's been fully delivered, or what do you think the next steps are there?
Well, I mean, I think what Cupp and Patterson did was finally force the state to reckon with its greatest failing since the 80s, which is fully funding education for kids in Ohio. They convened experts, practitioners around the state, came up with this formula, and it was the product of a lot of hard work, a lot of bipartisanship. And I think the most important thing is to have a formula. If you're not going to fully fund education for kids, you need to have a formula in there so that you can hold future general assemblies to account for it. So I think that was a very important first step, really transformational. It has not been fully implemented. The full potential of the Fair School Funding Plan has not been revealed yet. Until we get a legislature and a governor in there willing to actually say, you know what, we're just going to do it, we're probably going to see it come up short. They certainly have the money. And they just don't want to spend it. If you just look at the percentage of the state budget going to public school students now, when you take out all of the money going to charters and vouchers, if you just look at public school students at this point, 20% of the state budget goes to public school students. It used to be 40. So, it's just a matter of commitment. And you get that commitment up to 25%, and I think you can fully fund the Fair School Funding Plan. So great potential, great work that was done. We just got to keep plugging away and keep hammering them.
Keep voicing your concerns and
That's right.
needs. I believe in that. Can you explain what is the EdChoice program in Ohio, and how does that funding actually work? Where does the money come from?
It comes from the money that should be going to public school students. It literally comes out of the same line item in the state budget. So it's over $1 billion a year now. And EdChoice is basically just direct funding of private schools and subsidizing private school tuitions. And it doesn't matter how rich you are. Les Wexner's kids can get a voucher. They call them scholarships, but they're vouchers. So what's really interesting, I'm involved in the lawsuit where the judge recently found that the EdChoice system was actually unconstitutional for various reasons. But one of the really interesting things that came out of it was that the state is actually directly funding private schools. This money does not go to kids. It does not go to parents. It goes directly to the private school. And the private school gets to pick who their kids are, and then they go to the state and say, give us money. And that's what the state does. Now, the problem is when it goes to the private school, we have no idea how that money's being spent. We've spent almost $8 billion on these vouchers since they were introduced in 1996, 97. And we haven't audited a single penny. We have no idea how this money's being spent. I can't imagine another program in the entire country, another publicly financed program, where the recipients don't have to account for a single penny of $1 billion that's being spent their way. But that's exactly what the EdChoice program does now. And all their funding comes out of the same line item that's supposed to go to public school students. And instead it's going to private schools, and it's going to privately run charters. And When you add those two up, it's about $2.4 billion. It'll probably be this year. And that is roughly the amount of money that a fair school funding plan would cost if you fully funded it. So because of those programs, the 85% of kids in public schools don't have the resources they need from the state. 85% of the kids are getting 77% of the state resources, and that's just completely off kilter. So that's EdChoice. EdChoice is real simple. It's just basically a publicly subsidizing private schools, regardless of religion, background, curriculum, whatever. We're just subsidizing them with our tax dollars. We've always been told they were supposed to help kids in struggling school districts to escape failing public schools and go to these, awesome private schools. But instead, what we're seeing now is basically the full subsidizing of private education in the state of Ohio. It's just, it's frightening how much potential fraud could be going on. We just don't know. And that's a real problem.
Talk us through some misconceptions maybe you think people have about EdChoice.
Yeah, I mean, the big one is that this money goes to kids and families. It does not. It goes to private schools. There was a time back in the early days of the voucher program in the late 90s when the money did go to students and parents. It doesn't anymore. It goes to private schools directly. So that's a huge misconception. You always hear about money following the student, or it's really the parents' money or whatever. No, it goes directly to the private school. The second thing is that the private schools do not perform better than the public schools. Public schools perform the same, if not better, in the vast majority of cases. A few years ago, the Cincinnati Enquirer looked at it and found that in almost 90% of the cases, the kid going to the private school came from a higher performing public school. So again, it's, that's another myth I think that is out there. And the final one, and maybe the most important, is that this money is going to fund kids who are leaving the public school to go to the private. That's not true. About 85% of the money is going to kids who were never in the public school to begin with. We are subsidizing, using our taxpayer dollars to directly fund private schools for kids who are never in the public schools, regardless of income, and the schools don't perform noticeably better than the public schools.
So another topic I want to talk about is who controls school funding? Who makes the decisions about school funding?
The legislature and the governor. The Ohio General Assembly is tasked by the Ohio Constitution to do exactly one thing, and that is fund public schools. It's the only thing the Constitution requires them to pay for. So it's the legislature and it is the governor. The local school districts always catch the heat for all of this, and for some reason they have been afraid to direct the blame where it needs to be directed. It is a state responsibility to fund education. Local property taxes are meant as a partnership. It is not meant as a dependency. And unfortunately, I think what a lot of legislators have assumed, well, if we don't give them as much, they can just go raise a property tax. That may have been true 30 years ago. That is not true anymore. As you know, working on school levy campaigns is not what it used to be. There are many districts that never lost school levies that are losing them left and right now. It's just very difficult to ask people to part from their hard-earned property tax dollars. And so if you think that you're going to the ballot a lot in your district, it is because the state will not live up to its constitutional obligation, and they value charter schools and private schools over your kids. I can't make it any simpler than that. And because of that, you have to go to the ballot all the time, and you're seeing school districts have to deal with huge cuts or huge service issues or huge property tax increases.
For parents listening to this that might feel pretty removed from decisions being made at the state level, can you explain how those might show up in local classrooms and how these decisions could affect these families and their children?
Sure. If your kids are now sitting in classrooms that have 40 kids in them instead of 25, it's a state decision. If your kids now have to pay to play sports, state decision. If your kids now have to, be bused an hour to school instead of 15 minutes, state decision. If you start seeing the community is not able to use community learning center, all the time anymore, they have to vary the opening and closing time to deal with cost. It's a state decision. If you're not replacing retiring teachers, state decision. If there are any issues with services, any issues with transportation, any issues with staffing, you can look directly at the state That is whose responsibility it is to educate your kid. It's to pay for the education of your kid. It is not your local property taxpayers. It is not your local school board. It is the state. It is their responsibility. And for so long, we've become so used to local school districts and local taxpayers doing the thing that legislatures refuse to do, that we've come to expect that it's the local responsibility, but it's really the state. It's the state's responsibility, and the locals are there to support them. It's been reversed. And, so a lot of taxpayer anger is directed at local school boards, and it should really be directed at Capitol Square. And, I've always thought the most powerful thing that any school district could do is just get one bus from every school district during budget time to go down to Capitol Square and just flood the legislature with kids and parents and families. And can you imagine if 608 school buses showed up on Capitol Square during budget season? That would send a message. And that's what's been missing. Frankly, over the last 25 years. Charter schools have been really good at this, where they get their parents and their kids, they commit a week and they just get kids in buses and they just show up on Capitol Square, and they show up at the State House and they make their presence known and felt. And that's something we need to do on the public education side, where we need to have at least one busload of kids from every school district in the state showing up at the State House. And you'd be amazed how fast a lot of this stuff would change if they could see the power that local communities have to voice their concerns.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, a few closing questions. For families who feel like their schools might be doing well, why do you think they should still care about these issues?
Because even though you're doing well now, you could be doing better, first of all. And second of all, that just because you're doing well today is no guarantee you'll do well tomorrow. One thing we can learn from the history of the state of Ohio is they are very good at Robin Hood. So they will rob from the districts that are doing well and give to the districts that are doing less well. So they lower the performance of the higher performers, and they just barely make up the difference in the more struggling districts. So until you hold them to account and say, look, you need to give us our money and you need to give everyone else their money, because if you don't hold them to account for that, what they'll do is they'll just take your money and give it to someone else, because they all want to work off of the same pot. They don't want to expand it. So by fighting for equitable funding throughout the state, you are saving the funding in your own district. So, if you make sure that Northern Local and Perry County and Columbus and Lima and, Morgan County down in Southeast Ohio all get the money their kids need, guess what? They're not coming after your money. I hate to be as brass tacks as that, but yeah, you make sure that every district gets what they need, the state won't come after yours. And that's the bottom line.
Any closing comments, or is there anything you'd want any voter that's listening to this podcast to know before they head into a future election?
Yeah. When I ran for the legislature in 2006, I ran because I wanted to fix school funding. I'd been a reporter with the Beacon Journal for 10 years, and I'd written too many stories about struggles with education funding in Ohio. The Supreme Court said 4 times we need to fix school funding, and they refused to do it. So I decided to do something about it. And one of my friends at the Beacon told me, nobody ever lost an election because they cut money to schools. And that's kind of true in Ohio, and it needs to stop being true. So my advice is if there is a state candidate, either for state house or state senate, that will not disavow their support of EdChoice vouchers, say that we need to have high quality charter schools, not just more of them, and won't commit to fully fund the Fair School Funding Plan, you vote as hard as you can against that person. And, another friend of mine at the Beacon always told me, if they're getting away with it, it's your fault. And so don't let them get away with it. I hate to drop that on a mom podcast, but don't let them get away with that. They've gotten away with it for 30 years. It's time to end this. And until people start losing elections over education funding, I just don't know how you're going to be able to change it. So people need to make public education funding, the Fair School Funding Plan, EdChoice vouchers, which are now unconstitutional and costing us $1.2 billion a year and are not audited or anything like that. these issues are what's driving your frustration with property taxes. So don't let them get away with it. Make sure that everyone you vote for has a plan to fully fund the Fair School Funding Plan and a plan to rein in the voucher program, and that they're committing to it. And if they don't, vote like hell for the other person. And that's my advice. Make sure that this next generation of politician in the state of Ohio understands that if you vote to hurt public education, you will not win.
Thank you. So this conversation really highlights something important. School funding isn't just about budgets or policies. It's really about our values. It's about what we believe every child deserves and how we, as a state, especially Ohio, choose to support that. So, Stephen, thank you so much for helping break down this in a way that's understandable and meaningful for families, especially parents that might be hearing this for the first time. And for everyone listening, if this episode helped clarify things for you, please share it with someone else who's been trying to make sense of school funding in Ohio. Because the more we understand, the better decisions we make for our kids and for our communities.